Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology.
Hello all, this is Vishnu Priya, Assistant Professor, School of Physiotherapy, Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology, deemed to be University, Chennai. So, this is my second lecture video on vertebral column series. This lecture is all about segmental anatomy. These are the contents that we are going to see about. First, we are going to look on the cervical vertebra, its features, typical and atypical vertebra. Then, we'll see about the thoracic vertebra and its features, and the typical and atypical vertebrae. And finally, we'll have a quick summary. Before I kick off the session, I would like to give a brief intro about the vertebral column. So generally, vertebral column is having different segments. First segment is the cervical segment, second is thoracic, third is the lumbar, and fourth is the sacrum, and the final one is the coccyx. So here we have the 5 segments. Each segment is of its different shape and size. So here we could see all the different 5 segments. The first segment is the cervical, then we have the thoracic, lumbar, sacrum and coccyx. So today's session is all about the first 2 segments. First is the cervical and the second is the thoracic segment. Next we'll move on to the first segment, cervical. It includes 7 vertebral bones. These bones are going to be a connection between the skull bone and the next segment, which is the thoracic segment. So here we have the 7 vertebral bones. So generally the cervical bones are named like C1, C2, C3. So first we have C1, which is named as atlas, and the next bone is the C2, which is axis, and then we have C3, C4, C5, C6 and C7. So here we have the 7 cervical vertebrae. The first 2 cervical vertebrae are different in size and shape. So the first 2 vertebrae are atypical vertebrae and the remaining are typical. The last one, the 7th cervical, is also an atypical vertebra. The features of cervical vertebra include 3 distinguishing features. They have a bifid spinous process, and then they have a transverse foramen, which is a foramen which is present on the transverse process of each vertebra. So through that foramen the vertebral artery enters, and then so here we have the vertebral foramen, which is the central foramen through which the spinal cord runs from the cervical till the lumbar region. Next we will move on to the typical and atypical vertebrae of the cervical region. So at first here we have the typical vertebrae. Those are the vertebrae which have a similar feature. So here C2 to C6 is a typical vertebra, and then coming to the atypical vertebra, there are 3 atypical vertebrae in the cervical region. They are C1 vertebra, which has no vertebral body, no spinous process, and C2 vertebra, which has a odontoid process, which is a sharp prominence which is present over the body of the vertebra. And then finally C7, which has a longer spinous process, that's why it is called as a atypical vertebra. So here we have an example of a typical cervical vertebra. So here we have the atypical cervical vertebra. The first vertebra is the atlas. Here we could see that there is no vertebral body, no spinous process, and there is a transverse foramen on bilateral sides. And then next bone is the axis, which is also a atypical vertebra, which has a sharp bony prominence, bony projection, which is coming out of the vertebral body. That's why it is called as atypical vertebra. That bony prominence is called as dens or odontoid process. And then we have a final atypical vertebra, which is the C7 vertebra, which has a long and slender spinous process. That's why it is atypical. So these are the atlas and axis bone. The first bone here we could see is the atlas, which has no body, no spinous process, and the next bone is the axis, which has a sharp prominence, sharp projection called as odontoid process. These bones articulate with each other, forming atlantoaxial joint. So here we could see the atlantoaxial joint. This joint is responsible for nodding movements of the head. Then we have the C7th vertebra. This vertebra is also called as vertebra prominence because it has a sharp spinous process and it is an anatomical landmark. So here we could see the arrangement of all the 7 cervical vertebrae. The first one is the atlas, then we have the axis, then all the typical vertebrae from C3, C4, C5 to C6, and then finally we have the 7 cervical vertebrae. So here we have C1, C2 and C7. These are the atypical vertebrae and the remaining are the typical vertebrae. We could see the arrangement and here we could see the difference of each vertebra. Then we'll move on to the next segment, which is the thoracic segment. So the second segment here we have is the thoracic segment, which is going to be a junction between the cervical and then the lumbar region. This is the thoracic segment. It includes 12 thoracic vertebral bones. This thoracic segment is going to connect the thoracic cage or rib cage. So here we could see the next segment, thoracic segment. Here we have the 12 thoracic vertebrae. These vertebrae articulate with the ribs posteriorly and the ribs which articulate anteriorly to the sternum. So here we have all the arrangement of 12 thoracic vertebrae. So this is how it is articulating with the ribs. There is a special feature which is there in the thoracic vertebra. So here we have the rib bone which is articulating with the vertebral body. That joint we call it as costovertebral joint, and then the rib bone which is articulating with the transverse process, that joint we call it as costotransverse joint. So this is how all the 12 thoracic vertebrae are articulating with the 12 pairs of ribs which is going to form the thoracic cage. This is a typical thoracic vertebra. We have a vertebral body in the anterior region and a vertebral arch in the posterior region. The vertebral arch further divides into different processes. So here we have spinous process on the posterior side, transverse process on the bilateral sides, and then a central vertebral foramen. This is going to be a structure of a typical thoracic vertebra. As I told you, there is a special feature on the thoracic vertebra. So here we have demi-facets. So those are the facets for articulation of the ribs. So here we could see a pair of demi-facet this side. On the contralateral side we have another pair of demi-facets, and also we have a costal facet on the transverse process of each vertebra. So these facets are responsible for articulation of the rib bones. So here we could see the demi-facets and the facets over the transverse process. Finally, we have typical and atypical thoracic vertebra. So from T2 to T8, these are the typical vertebrae, and then atypical vertebrae are T1, which has a single pair of whole facets for first rib articulation. So in the first thoracic vertebra, which has only one whole pair of vertebral facets, which is for articulation for the rib bones. And then next we have a atypical vertebra T9, which has a single demi-facet. Here we could see the single demi-facet which is over the T9th vertebra. Then moving on to the next atypical T10, here also we have a single pair of whole facet. Whole facet means which is circular in nature. Then T11 to T12, which has a single pair of whole facets, and there is no facet on the transverse process. So in this 11th and 12th vertebra, there is no facet on the transverse process, but there is a whole process on the T11 and T12 vertebra. These are the typical and atypical vertebrae of thoracic region. So on summary, we have seen about the cervical segment and thoracic segment. We have seen the distinguishing features of typical and atypical vertebra of both cervical and thoracic segment. Thank you.